The weight of Noah Rodriguez's words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Eric Hughes felt his world tilt on its axis as he stared into those dark eyes that had haunted his dreams for months, searching for any sign that this was some elaborate joke. But there was no humor in Noah's expression, only raw vulnerability and a trembling hope that made Eric's chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to recognition. Whoa. Noah whispered again, his voice barely audible above the soft patter of rain against the apartment window. Quote, where Eric's hand flew to his mouth, fingers trembling against his lips as the confession settled into his bones like electricity finding ground. The living room around them seemed to shrink, the familiar space of Noah's apartment suddenly charged with an energy that made the air feel thick and impossible to breathe. He could smell Noah's cologne, that warm cedar scent that had become synonymous with safety and home, and beneath it, the faint trace of the coffee they'd been sharing just moments before everything changed. Quote, to Eric breathed, but the name came out broken, fractured by the weight of everything he'd never allowed himself to acknowledge. The way his heart raced whenever Noah smiled, the way he found excuses to touch his shoulder, his arm, any point of contact that felt innocent enough to explain away. The way he'd been comparing every relationship to the easy intimacy he shared with his best friend, never understanding why no one else ever felt quite right. Bubble 3, Noah continued, taking a step closer, close enough that Eric could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, the ones that appeared when he was nervous or excited. Quote 4, but to understand how they arrived at this moment, how two best friends found themselves balanced on the precipice of something that would either save them or shatter them completely, we need to go back 3 months earlier, to the night that started it all. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. Eric had been staring at his phone for the better part of an hour, thumb hovering over Noah's contact information like he was defusing a bomb. The text he wanted to send felt simultaneously too simple and impossibly complicated. His apartment felt too quiet, too empty, filled with shadows that reminded him of everything he was trying not to think about. The breakup with Jessica had been messy and public, ending with her throwing his belongings out of her apartment window while half the neighborhood watched from their balconies. Quote 5. He'd finally typed, then deleted it. Too needy. Can I come over? Delete. Too presumptuous. Are you busy? Delete. Too vague. The truth was that Eric Hughes had never been good at asking for what he needed, especially not from Noah. Their friendship had always been built on an easy rhythm where Noah anticipated his moods and offered comfort before Eric had to swallow his pride and request it. But tonight felt different, heavier somehow, like the weight of his latest failed relationship was pressing against his chest and making it hard to breathe normally. Finally, he'd settled on something honest. Quote 8, Noah's response had come back within seconds. Doors unlocked. I'll make coffee. The 15-minute walk to Noah's apartment had felt like a pilgrimage through his own confusion. Eric found himself cataloging the ways his relationship with Jessica had felt wrong from the beginning. How he'd been going through the motions of romance without ever feeling the spark everyone talked about. She was beautiful, successful, everything he thought he should want. But being with her had felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. He'd blamed it on timing, on stress from work, on anything except the growing suspicion that maybe the problem wasn't with Jessica at all. Noah had opened the door before Eric could knock, like he'd been watching from the window. He was wearing that soft gray sweater that made his eyes look almost black, his hair mussed like he'd been running his fingers through it. The sight of him had hit Eric with a wave of relief so profound it was almost physical, like coming home after a long journey to find everything exactly as you'd left it. Rough night, Noah had asked, stepping aside to let him in, and Eric had caught that scent again. Cedar and something uniquely Noah that made his shoulders relax for the first time all day. You could say that. Eric had collapsed onto the familiar couch, sinking into cushions that knew the shape of his body from countless movie nights and late-night conversations. Jessica and I are done, like spectacularly done. I'm pretty sure there's video of her throwing my stuff out the window circulating on social media by now. Noah had disappeared into the kitchen, returning with two steaming mugs and settling onto the opposite end of the couch with the careful distance he always maintained when Eric was processing a breakup. It was a kindness Eric had never fully appreciated before. The way Noah gave him space to fall apart without making him feel judged or rushed. "Want to talk about it?" Noah had asked, wrapping his hands around his mug like he needed the warmth. Eric had found himself studying Noah's profile in the soft lamplight, noticing details he'd somehow missed in 3 years of friendship. The way Noah's eyelashes cast shadows on his cheekbones, the gentle curve of his mouth when he was listening intently, the way his presence seemed to fill the room with a calm energy that made Eric feel like he could breathe again. "Mit amor," Eric had said finally, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Could have phantom." Noah had turned to face him fully then, dark eyes serious and focused in a way that made Eric's chest tighten. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Eric had struggled to find words for something he'd never spoken aloud. Quote random. The silence that followed had stretched between them like a held breath. Noah had set his coffee mug on the table with deliberate care, his movements precise and controlled in the way they became when he was thinking deeply about something. Quote Saint Noah had said softly, quote 20 qua. The question had caught Eric off guard, forcing him to examine something he'd always accepted as a distant concept. He'd closed his eyes, trying to picture it, and found himself thinking about safety, about coming home, about the way he felt sitting on this very couch, sharing coffee and conversation with someone who knew him well enough to ask the right questions. Quote 21. Eric had said slowly, quote 22. When he'd opened his eyes, Noah had been watching him with an expression Eric couldn't quite read, something soft and sad and hopeful all at once. Cortas de Noah had said quietly. Quote, the conversation had continued late into the night, winding through topics they'd never explored before. Noah had asked questions that made Eric examine his assumptions about relationships, about attraction, about what he actually wanted from life. And somewhere in the space between midnight and dawn, as they talked and laughed and shared the kind of deep honesty that only came with exhaustion and trust, Eric had felt something shift inside his chest. He'd fallen asleep on Noah's couch that night, covered by the soft throw blanket Noah kept draped over the back for exactly these occasions. When he'd woken up the next morning to the smell of coffee and pancakes, Noah had been moving around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, already dressed for work, but taking the time to make Eric breakfast before he left. "Thank you," Eric had said, and he'd meant it for more than just the food, more than just the couch to sleep on. He'd meant it for the questions that had cracked something open inside him, for the safety to examine parts of himself he'd kept carefully locked away. Noah had smiled, that warm, genuine expression that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. But as Eric had walked home that morning, still wearing yesterday's clothes and carrying the taste of Noah's coffee on his tongue, he'd found himself thinking about the way Noah's hand had brushed his shoulder when he'd said goodbye. The brief contact had sent electricity up his arm, a spark of awareness that felt entirely new and completely familiar at the same time. He'd spent the rest of the day trying to convince himself it was just gratitude, just the emotional vulnerability of a difficult night making him read too much into a simple gesture. But the feeling had lingered, settling into his bones like a truth he wasn't ready to acknowledge. The weeks that followed had been a study in careful observation and growing confusion. Eric found himself paying attention to details about Noah that had somehow escaped his notice before. The way Noah's voice dropped when he was tired, the unconscious grace in his movements when he thought no one was watching, the way he listened with his whole body, leaning in slightly when someone was speaking, making them feel like the most important person in the room. Eric started finding excuses to spend time at Noah's apartment. Work stress, he'd claim, or problems with his landlord, or simple boredom. Noah never questioned these explanations, simply made space for him on the couch and in his evening routine with the easy generosity that defined their friendship. But the more time they spent together, the more Eric found himself noticing things that made his chest tight with something he couldn't name. The way Noah's eyes would linger on his face when he thought Eric wasn't looking. The way Noah seemed to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, appearing with coffee when Eric was tired or suggesting a movie when he seemed restless. The way Noah's presence had become as essential as breathing, so woven into the fabric of his daily life, that Eric couldn't imagine existing without it. 3 weeks after that first night on Noah's couch, Eric had been getting ready for a date with someone new, a guy named Marcus he'd met through a dating app. As he'd stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time, he'd found himself thinking about Noah, wondering what Noah would think of his outfit choice, wishing Noah was the one he was getting dressed up for. The realization had hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making him grip the edge of the sink until his knuckles went white. He was attracted to Noah, had been attracted to Noah for months, maybe longer, without allowing himself to recognize what those feelings meant. The date with Marcus had been a disaster. Eric had spent the entire evening distracted, comparing everything about Marcus to Noah and finding every comparison lacking. Marcus was handsome enough, charming in a practiced way, but he didn't make Eric feel like he was coming home. He didn't ask the kinds of questions that made Eric examine his own thoughts. He didn't have Noah's easy laugh or the way Noah's attention felt like being wrapped in sunlight. Eric had ended the date early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely a lie, and found himself walking toward Noah's apartment without making a conscious decision to go there. His feet had carried him through familiar streets, while his mind raced, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd discovered about himself. Noah had taken one look at Eric's face when he had opened the door and stepped aside without a word, leading him to the kitchen and starting the coffee maker with practiced efficiency. "Bad date?" Noah had asked gently, and Eric had almost laughed at the understatement. "You could say that." Eric had slumped into one of the kitchen chairs, watching Noah move around the familiar space. "I think I'm broken, Noah. Like, fundamentally damaged in some way that makes normal relationships impossible." Noah had turned from the counter, coffee forgotten, and Eric had been struck again by the intensity of his focus when he was concerned about something. "What happened?" "Nothing happened. That's the problem." Eric had run his hands through his hair, frustrated with his inability to articulate the complexity of what he was feeling. He was nice, attractive, funny, everything I should want. But sitting across from him at dinner, all I could think about was how he wasn't. He'd stopped himself just in time, the words "how he wasn't you" dying on his tongue as he realized how dangerous that confession would be. "Wasn't what?" Noah had prompted softly, and there had been something in his voice, a careful neutrality that suggested he already knew what Eric had been about to say. "Wasn't right," Eric had finished lamely. "I don't know what's wrong with me. I keep thinking I'll meet someone and feel that spark everyone talks about, but it never happens. And tonight, sitting there with Marcus, I realized I have felt that spark. He'd trailed off again, unable to finish the thought without revealing too much. But Noah had been watching him with those dark, perceptive eyes, and Eric had the uncomfortable feeling that his best friend could read every thought written across his face. "Eat it in Code 36. Noah had asked quietly, and the question had hung in the air between them like a challenge. Eric had stared at his hands, unable to meet Noah's gaze. "It doesn't matter. It's not something I can pursue." "Why not?" The simple question had made Eric's chest tighten with panic. "Because it's you," he'd wanted to say. "Because I'm in love with my best friend, and I don't even know when it happened. Because the thought of losing you is more terrifying than never finding love at all." Instead, he'd shaken his head. "It's complicated." Noah had been quiet for a long moment, and when Eric had finally looked up, he'd found Noah studying him with an expression that was equal parts understanding and frustration. Quote 40. Noah had said carefully, quote 41. Eric had nodded, not trusting his voice. Quote 42. The question had landed like a bomb in the quiet kitchen, shattering the careful distance Eric had been maintaining from his own realizations. His first instinct had been to deny it, to laugh it off as ridiculous, but the words had stuck in his throat as he'd met Noah's steady gaze. Quote 43. Eric had started, then stopped, his mind racing through years of relationships that had felt like performances, attractions that had seemed more intellectual than physical, moments of connection that had always felt just slightly out of reach. Noah had continued gently. Quote on. Eric had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the relief of having someone put words to the confusion that had been eating at him for months. Quote 46. He'd whispered, I honestly don't know. I thought I was attracted to women, but maybe I was just attracted to the idea of being normal, of fitting in. Noah had reached across the table then, covering Eric's hand with his own, and the contact had sent that familiar electricity shooting up Eric's arm. But this time, instead of pushing the feeling away, Eric had allowed himself to really feel it. The warmth of Noah's skin against his, the way his pulse quickened at the simple touch, the way everything in him seemed to settle and come alive at the same time. Unfortunately, no, Noah had said firmly. Quote blind, Eric had turned his hand palm up, threading their fingers together, and had watched Noah's eyes widen slightly at the deliberate intimacy of the gesture. What if it is? What if I am? Then you're still the same person you've always been, Noah had said softly. Still my best friend. Still someone I care about more than anyone else in the world. The words had been meant to comfort, Eric knew, but they'd also carried an undertone that made his heart race. The way Noah had said care about had felt weighted with meaning, loaded with all the things they weren't saying to each other. They'd sat like that for several minutes, hands linked across the kitchen table, both of them staring at their joined fingers like they held the answers to questions they were afraid to ask. Finally, Noah had squeezed Eric's hand gently and pulled away, the loss of contact making Eric feel suddenly cold. You should probably get some sleep, Noah had said, but his voice had been rough around the edges, like the words were costing him something. It's late, and you've had a lot to process tonight. Eric had wanted to argue, to stay in this moment where everything felt possible and terrifying, and right all at once. But he'd also known that Noah was right, that he needed time to sit with these realizations and figure out what they meant for his life, for their friendship. Quote Vafton, Eric had started, then stopped, embarrassed by what he'd been about to ask. Can you what? Can I stay here tonight? On the couch, I mean, I don't want to be alone right now. Noah's expression had softened, and he'd nodded without hesitation. Of course, you never have to ask. As Eric had settled onto the familiar couch with Noah's spare pillow and the soft throw blanket, he'd heard Noah moving around in his bedroom, getting ready for bed. The domestic sounds had filled him with a longing so sharp it was almost physical, a desire not just for Noah's body, but for this life, this easy intimacy, this feeling of home. He'd lain awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had shifted in the space of a single conversation. The possibility that he was gay felt both shocking and inevitable, like a truth he'd been avoiding his entire adult life. But more than that, the possibility that his feelings for Noah might be reciprocated felt too enormous to fully comprehend. Because there had been something in Noah's eyes when he'd asked about Eric's attraction to women, something that suggested the question hadn't been purely academic. And the way Noah had held his hand, the way he'd said he cared about Eric more than anyone else in the world, it felt like the kind of confession that lived in the spaces between words. The next morning had brought a new awkwardness between them, a careful politeness that felt like they were both trying not to break something fragile. Noah had made coffee and toast, but they'd eaten in relative silence, both of them seeming to understand that the previous night's conversation had opened a door that neither of them was quite ready to walk through. Thank you, Eric had said as he prepared to leave for work, and Noah had nodded, understanding that the gratitude encompassed far more than just breakfast and a place to sleep. Quote 60. Noah had replied, but there had been a question in his eyes, a hope that made Eric's chest tight with possibility and fear. The following weeks had been a careful dance around the new awareness that hummed between them. Eric had thrown himself into researching sexuality and identity, reading articles and forums and personal stories that helped him understand that his experience wasn't unique. The more he'd learned, the more certain he'd become that Noah's intuition had been right. He was gay, had probably always been gay, just too afraid of what that meant to acknowledge it. But understanding his sexuality had only made his feelings for Noah more complicated. Because now he knew that his attraction was real and valid, but he still didn't know if it was reciprocated. And the fear of losing Noah's friendship by pursuing something more felt paralyzing. Noah, for his part, had seemed to be giving Eric space to process. But there had been moments when Eric had caught him watching with an expression that made his heart race. Moments when their hands had brushed reaching for the same thing, and Noah had let the contact linger just a second longer than necessary. Moments when Noah's attention had felt so focused and intense that Eric had wondered if he was imagining the electricity between them. 2 months after that pivotal night in Noah's kitchen, Eric had finally worked up the courage to go on a date with a man. Someone he'd met through a friend, someone safe and understanding who wouldn't judge him for being new to this. The date itself had been pleasant enough, a confirmation that yes, he was definitely attracted to men in a way he'd never been attracted to women. But even as he'd enjoyed the conversation and the easy chemistry, Eric had found himself thinking about Noah, comparing this new person to his best friend and finding every comparison lacking. Because this man, nice as he was, didn't know Eric's coffee order or the way he liked his eggs cooked. He didn't know that Eric got quiet when he was overwhelmed or that he had a scar on his knee from falling off his bike when he was 7. He didn't know Eric the way Noah knew him, with the kind of intimate understanding that came from 3 years of friendship and countless hours of conversation. Eric had ended that date with a polite kiss and a promise to call, but he'd known, even as he'd said it, that he wouldn't follow through, because he'd finally understood what he'd been looking for all along. And it wasn't this kind stranger, no matter how attractive or compatible he might be. It was Noah. It had always been Noah. The realization had sent Eric into a spiral of anxiety and hope that had consumed the better part of a week. He'd found himself analyzing every interaction he had ever had with Noah, looking for signs that his feelings might be reciprocated. The way Noah always seemed to have time for him, no matter how busy his schedule. The way Noah remembered details about Eric's life that even Eric sometimes forgot. The way Noah's face lit up when Eric walked into a room, like his presence was the best part of Noah's day. But he'd also remembered all the times Noah had talked about past relationships with women, all the ways their friendship had remained carefully platonic, despite the obvious affection between them. And the fear of misreading the situation, of destroying the most important relationship in his life, had kept him paralyzed with indecision. It had been Noah who'd finally forced the issue 3 months after that first night on his couch. Eric had been avoiding him for nearly a week, too overwhelmed by his own feelings to trust himself in Noah's presence. But Noah had shown up at Eric's apartment on a Friday night, armed with takeout from Eric's favorite restaurant and a determined expression that brooked no argument. "We need to talk," Noah had said, pushing past Eric into the apartment and setting the food on the kitchen counter with deliberate care. "You've been avoiding me for days, and I want to know why." Eric had felt his carefully constructed defenses crumble at the hurt in Noah's voice. "We're trying to quote," or Noah had turned to face him, dark eyes flashing with frustration. Quote Savannah. The raw vulnerability in Noah's voice had broken something inside Eric's chest, because of course Noah would blame himself, would assume that Eric's distance was somehow his fault, rather than the result of Eric's own cowardice. Quote shower down, Eric had said quietly. Quote 67. Noah had stared at him for a long moment, confusion and something that might have been hope flickering across his features. Quote 68. And that's when Eric had known that he couldn't keep running from this, couldn't keep protecting himself at the expense of Noah's feelings. Because Noah deserved honesty, deserved to know why Eric had been pulling away, even if it meant risking everything. Eric had said, the words tumbling out before he could lose his nerve. Quote 70. The silence that had followed Eric's confession had felt eternal, stretching between them like a chasm that might never be crossed. Noah had gone very still, his face cycling through expressions too quickly for Eric to read, and Eric had felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he'd waited for some kind of response. Quote 71. Noah had finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, and there had been something in his tone that had made Eric's chest tighten with hope and terror in equal measure. "I know," Eric had rushed on, unable to stop the words now that they'd started flowing. Quote 73. Noah had taken a step closer, close enough that Eric could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, the ones that appeared when he was nervous or excited. Quote 7. Quote 70. Quote yes, Eric had swallowed hard, knowing that this answer would reveal just how blind he'd been to his own feelings. I think since that first night I slept on your couch, maybe longer. I just didn't understand what it was until recently." Noah had reached up then, cupping Eric's face in his hands with a gentleness that had made Eric's eyes flutter closed. Eric, look at me. When Eric had opened his eyes, Noah had been watching him with an expression so tender it had made his knees weak. I've been in love with you for 2 years and 4 months, Noah had whispered. Since that night you showed up at my door crying about Marcus, and I held you while you fell apart on my couch. I've been pretending to be your best friend while dying inside every time you told me about another guy who didn't deserve you. The words had hit Eric like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making him reach out to grip Noah's shoulders for support. Noah had continued, his thumbs brushing across Eric's cheekbones in a gesture so intimate it had made Eric's heart stutter. Eric had felt tears sliding down his cheeks, overwhelmed by the revelation that Noah had been suffering in silence just as he had, that they'd both been too afraid to risk their friendship for the possibility of something more. Noah, he'd whispered, and the name had come out broken, fractured by the weight of everything they'd both been carrying. I love the way you laugh when something really amuses you, Noah had said softly, his hand still framing Eric's face. Quote on 86. Each word had felt like a gift, like Noah was giving Eric pieces of himself that he'd been hoarding in secret. Eric had reached up to cover Noah's hands with his own, holding them against his face like an anchor. Eric had said, his voice thick with emotion. Wadwadi, Noah had smiled then, that warm, genuine expression that made his eyes crinkle at the corners, and Eric had felt something settle into place in his chest, like a puzzle piece finding its proper position. Book 89. Noah had asked, and the question had been so soft, so reverent, that Eric had felt his heart skip several beats. Atmadum. Eric had whispered, and then Noah's lips had been on his, soft and warm and perfect. The kiss had started tentative, a gentle brush of lips that had tasted like coffee and possibility. But as Eric had melted into Noah's touch, as he'd finally allowed himself to want this without reservation, the kiss had deepened, becoming urgent and desperate and full of 2 years' worth of suppressed longing. Eric had wound his arms around Noah's neck, pulling him closer, and Noah had responded by backing Eric against the kitchen counter, his body warm and solid and real against Eric's. They'd kissed like they were cronies, and each other was air, like they were trying to make up for all the time they'd wasted being afraid. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing heavily, Noah had rested his forehead against Eric's, his eyes still closed like he was trying to memorize the moment. Sotan. Eric had breathed, and Noah had laughed, the sound vibrating through his chest where it was pressed against Eric's. Yeah, wow. They'd stood like that for several minutes, holding each other in the quiet kitchen while the takeout grew cold on the counter, both of them seeming to understand that this moment was a threshold they couldn't uncross. Everything was different now. Everything was better. I'm scared, Eric had admitted eventually, his voice muffled against Noah's shoulder. Quote, Noah had replied, his arms tightening around Eric. Quote 95. Eric had pulled back to meet Noah's gaze, finding the same mixture of fear and determination reflected in those dark eyes that he felt in his own chest. What do we do now? I don't know, Noah had said honestly. I've never done this before. I've never been in love with my best friend. But I want to figure it out. I want to try it in. Even if it's messy, even if we don't know what we're doing. Noah had cupped Eric's face again, his touch gentle but certain. Chapter 100. The relief Eric had felt at those words had been overwhelming, like a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying had suddenly been lifted from his shoulders. Quote 101, he'd said, and the words had felt like coming home. I love you too, Noah had replied, and then he'd kissed Eric again, soft and sweet and full of promise. They'd spent the rest of the evening on Noah's couch, talking through years of misunderstandings and missed signals, recontextualizing every moment of their friendship through the lens of this new knowledge. Eric had learned that Noah had been just as confused about his own feelings, had spent months convincing himself that his love for Eric was purely platonic, even as he'd found excuses to spend time with him, to touch him in small, seemingly innocent ways. I used to lie awake at night wondering what it would be like to hold you, Noah had confessed, his fingers tracing patterns on Eric's arm as they'd curled together on the couch. I'd imagine what it would feel like to wake up next to you, to have the right to touch you whenever I wanted, and then I'd feel guilty for thinking about you that way when you trusted me to be your friend. I did the same thing, Eric had admitted. I'd catch myself staring at your mouth when you talked, or getting jealous when you mentioned going on dates. But I convinced myself it was just because I cared about you as a friend, because I didn't want to see you get hurt. They'd talked until nearly dawn, sharing confessions and fears and hopes for what their relationship might become. And when Eric had finally fallen asleep in Noah's arms, his head pillowed on Noah's chest and their legs tangled together, he'd felt more at peace than he had in months. The next few weeks had been a period of careful navigation as they'd learned how to be together as more than friends. They'd taken things slowly, both of them aware that they were building something precious that deserved to be protected. There had been long conversations about what they wanted, about boundaries and expectations, and how to handle the shift from friendship to romance. There had also been moments of pure joy, like the first time Noah had called him baby, in that soft, affectionate tone that had made Eric's heart skip. Or the morning Eric had woken up in Noah's bed to find Noah watching him with such tender love that Eric had felt tear prick at the corners of his eyes. "Good morning, beautiful," Noah had whispered, brushing Eric's hair back from his face, and Eric had felt like he might burst from happiness. Quote 109, Eric had murmured, stretching like a cat in the warm sunlight streaming through Noah's bedroom window. "Good," Noah had said, pressing a soft kiss to Eric's forehead. The words had been casual, thrown out in the lazy intimacy of a Sunday morning, but they'd hit Eric with the force of a promise. Because that's what this was, he'd realized. Not just a relationship or a romantic experiment, but a commitment to building a life together, to choosing each other every day. 3 weeks after their first kiss, Eric had been faced with his first real test of their new relationship. Marcus, the ex-boyfriend whose breakup had inadvertently started Eric's journey of self-discovery, had called wanting to meet for coffee and quote 112 quote. Eric's first instinct had been to decline, but Noah had encouraged him to go, understanding that Eric needed closure from his past relationships in order to move fully into their future. The coffee shop Marcus had chosen was crowded and impersonal, the kind of place where difficult conversations could be had without too much risk of emotional breakdown. Marcus had looked exactly as Eric remembered him, handsome in a conventional way, but sitting across from him, Eric had felt nothing but mild fondness and a lot of gratitude for the way things had ended between them. "You look good," Marcus had said, studying Eric's face with the kind of intensity that suggested he was looking for signs of heartbreak or regret. "Tall Horder found, quote one fee," Eric had replied honestly. Quote what's sitting, Marcus had nodded, stirring in his coffee with unnecessary focus. Quote woman, Eric had felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth at the thought of Noah, at the way Noah had kissed him goodbye that morning with sleepy affection and the promise to make dinner when Eric got home. Marcus had said, and to his credit, he'd sounded like he meant it. "I have to admit, I was hoping we might be able to work things out, but I can see that ship has sailed." "Marcus," Eric had said gently, "even if I weren't with someone else, we weren't right for each other. We both know that." Marcus had been quiet for a moment, then had looked up with curious eyes. "Can I ask what changed? Because you seem like a completely different person than you were when we were together. More, I don't know, more yourself, I guess." Eric had considered how to answer that question, how to explain the journey he'd been on without revealing more than Marcus needed to know. Quote 124, he'd said finally, and more importantly, "I figured out who I am." The conversation had continued for another hour, both of them finding the closure they needed to move forward without resentment or regret. When they'd parted ways outside the coffee shop, Marcus had hugged Eric goodbye with genuine warmth. Marcus had said, and Eric had felt his chest fill with warmth at the casual assumption about his new partner's gender. It felt like another small step toward living authentically, toward being honest about who he was and what he wanted. "He does," Eric had replied, thinking of Noah's constant expressions of gratitude and wonder that Eric had chosen him. Quote 128. The drive home had given Eric time to process the encounter, to appreciate how far he'd come from the confused, disconnected person he'd been just a few months earlier. Seeing Marcus again had only confirmed what he'd already known, that what he'd shared with his ex-boyfriend had been a pale imitation of real love, a relationship built on expectation and convenience rather than genuine connection. What he had with Noah was different in every possible way. It was built on years of friendship, on deep knowledge and genuine affection, on the kind of love that made him want to be a better person just because Noah believed he already was one. When Eric had arrived home, he'd found Noah in the kitchen, stirring something that smelled like heaven and humming under his breath. The sight had filled Eric with such overwhelming love that he'd had to stop in the doorway just to catch his breath. Photo 129. Noah had asked without turning around, somehow sensing Eric's presence the way he always did. Eric had crossed the kitchen and wrapped his arms around Noah's waist from behind, pressing a kiss to the back of his neck. Quote 130. Noah had leaned back into Eric's embrace, his body relaxing against Eric's chest. Quote 132. Eric had murmured against Noah's skin, only that we wasted so much time being afraid. Noah had turned in Eric's arms then, his face soft with understanding. Quote 134, but quote 135. Eric had agreed, though part of him would always wonder what might have happened if they'd been braver sooner. But I'm glad we're here now. Me too, Noah had said, and then he'd kissed Eric with the kind of passion that made everything else fade away. They'd made love that night with a tenderness that had brought tears to Eric's eyes, moving together like they'd been designed for each other, like every touch was a conversation and every kiss was a promise. Afterward, as they'd lain tangled together in Noah's bed, Eric had felt a completeness he'd never experienced before. He'd whispered into the darkness, and Noah's arms had tightened around him. Quote 139, Noah had replied. Quote 140. The months that followed had been a study in domestic bliss, punctuated by the normal challenges of any new relationship. They'd had their first fight about whose turn it was to do dishes, resolved with laughter and apologies, and the kind of make-up sex that had left them both grinning like idiots. They'd navigated the sometimes awkward process of coming out to friends and family, finding overwhelming support from people who'd apparently been waiting for them to figure out what everyone else had already seen. Eric's parents had taken the news with surprising grace, his mother admitting that she'd always wondered why Eric's relationships with women had seemed so forced. Who 141 she'd said, and when she'd met Noah a few weeks later, she'd pulled Eric aside to tell him she'd never seen him look so content. Noah's family had been equally supportive, welcoming Eric with the kind of warmth that had made him feel like he'd gained not just a boyfriend, but an entire extended family who loved him simply because Noah loved him. The most challenging part had been learning to trust that this happiness was real, that it wasn't going to disappear if Eric let himself fully believe in it. He'd spent so many years feeling disconnected from his own relationships that the depth of his connection with Noah sometimes felt too good to be true. But Noah had been patient with Eric's occasional moments of panic, understanding that healing from years of living inauthentically took time. When Eric had woken up one morning, convinced that Noah was going to realize he'd made a mistake, Noah had held him close and whispered reassurances until Eric's breathing had calmed. "You're not getting rid of me that easily," Noah had said, pressing kisses to Eric's temple. Quote 5 words, quote, and Eric had asked, voicing his deepest fear. Quote 145 out. Noah had replied without hesitation. Quote 146 Those words had become a touchstone for Eric, something he'd return to whenever doubt crept in. Because Noah was right. Love wasn't just about the butterflies and the passion, though they had plenty of both. It was about the choice to build a life together, to support each other through difficulties, to grow together instead of apart. 6 months after their first kiss, Noah had asked Eric to move in with him officially. The request had come on a lazy Sunday morning as they'd been making breakfast together, moving around Noah's kitchen with the easy choreography of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. Quote 147, Noah had said, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. Quote 148. Eric had felt his heart swell with affection for this man who always seemed to know exactly what Eric needed to hear. Quote 149. Quote 150. Noah had said, setting down the spatula and turning to face him fully. Quote 151. The move itself had been surprisingly simple, Mostly because Eric had been gradually bringing his belongings to Noah's apartment over the months they'd been together. But there had been something profound about officially giving up his lease, about having his name added to Noah's mailbox, about hanging his clothes next to Noah's in the closet. Quote 152. Eric had said on their first official night as roommates, looking around the living room that was now definitively theirs rather than Noah's with Eric as a frequent guest. Good different or bad different? Noah had asked, settling onto the couch and pulling Eric down beside him. The best different, Eric had replied, curling into Noah's side with the contentment of someone who'd finally found where they belonged. Like coming home. 1 year after their first kiss, Noah had surprised Eric with a weekend trip to the cabin where they'd spent their first official vacation together as a couple. It was the same place where Eric had finally felt comfortable enough to talk about his fears regarding his sexuality, where Noah had listened with infinite patience as Eric had worked through years of internalized confusion and self-doubt, which from Eric had said, and as they'd sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and pink. Noah had reached over to take Eric's hand, threading their fingers together in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Do you ever regret it? Taking the risk, I mean. Telling me how you felt? Eric had turned to study Noah's profile in the fading light, struck again by how beautiful he was, how the sight of him still made Eric's heart skip after all this time. Never, not for a single second, do you? The only thing I regret, Noah had said softly, is that we waited so long. But maybe we needed that time to be ready for this. They'd made love that night with a passion tempered by deep affection, moving together like they'd been doing this for decades instead of months. And afterward, as they'd lain in the unfamiliar bed with moonlight streaming through the windows, Eric had felt a peace so profound it had brought tears to his eyes. Cool 162. Noah had asked, noticing Eric's emotional state with the sensitivity that defined their relationship. Just this, Eric had replied, gesturing vaguely at the space between them, at the life they'd built together. So our kid, Noah had agreed, pressing a soft kiss to Eric's shoulder. Like we were always supposed to end up here. I love you, Eric had whispered, the words carrying the weight of everything he felt but couldn't adequately express. Jashoyan, Noah had replied. Quote 29, the second year of their relationship had brought new challenges and deeper intimacy. They'd weathered Eric's job change and the stress that came with it, Noah providing unwavering support as Eric had navigated a career transition that had left him feeling uncertain and vulnerable. They dealt with Noah's father's health scare, Eric stepping up to help coordinate medical appointments and provide emotional support during a difficult time. Through it all, their love had only grown stronger, deepened by the knowledge that they could count on each other when life got complicated. Eric had learned that Noah became quietly efficient when stressed, channeling his anxiety into taking care of practical details. Noah had learned that Eric needed physical comfort when overwhelmed, responding to touch in ways that words couldn't always reach. Quote 170. Noah had said one evening after they successfully navigated a particularly challenging week, involving Eric's work crisis and Noah's family emergency simultaneously. The best team, Eric had agreed, settling into Noah's arms with the bone-deep relief of someone who'd found their person. I can't imagine doing any of this without you. Good thing you don't have to, Noah had replied, and the simple certainty in his voice had made Eric's chest tight with gratitude. As their second anniversary had approached, Eric had found himself thinking about the future in ways he'd never allowed himself to before. Not just the immediate future of next month or next year, but the long-term future of decades in growing old together and building something that would last. The realization that he wanted to marry Noah had come gradually, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow understanding that this was the person he wanted to choose every day for the rest of his life. The thought had been both thrilling and terrifying, representing the level of commitment that felt enormous and completely natural at the same time. I want to marry you, Eric had said one morning, the words tumbling out over coffee and toast like they'd been waiting for the right moment to escape. Noah had gone very still, his coffee mug halfway to his lips, and Eric had felt a moment of panic that he'd misread the situation, that Noah wasn't ready for that level of commitment. Noah had said carefully, setting down his mug with deliberate precision. Quote 176 and quote 1, Eric had replied, suddenly nervous. Quote 178, Noah's face had broken into the kind of smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners, the expression that had first made Eric fall in love with him. Of course I want that. I've wanted that since about 6 months into our relationship, but I didn't want to scare you off. You could never scare me off, Eric had said, reaching across the table to take Noah's hand. Quote 181, quote 182, Noah had replied, bringing Eric's hand to his lips and pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. Because I plan on loving you for the next 60 years, minimum. The actual proposal had come 3 months later, on the anniversary of the night Eric had first slept on Noah's couch, the night that had started their journey toward each other. Noah had recreated that evening perfectly, down to the same takeout restaurant, in the same movie they'd watched. But when Eric had settled onto the couch expecting their usual comfortable evening, Noah had dropped to one knee with a ring that was absolutely perfect. Eric Hughes, Noah had said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. You are the love of my life, my best friend, and the person I want to grow old with. Will you marry me? Eric had said yes through tears of joy, and they'd spent the rest of the evening making plans and calling family and friends to share their news. The response had been overwhelmingly positive, with Eric's mother crying happy tears and Noah's sister immediately starting to plan an engagement party. Quote, Eric had said later that night as they'd lain in bed, both of them too excited to sleep. I can, Noah had replied, playing with the ring on Eric's finger. Quote, the engagement period had been a whirlwind of planning and preparation, but through it all, Eric had felt a deep sense of rightness about their decision. This wasn't just about the wedding or the legal recognition of their relationship. It was about making a public declaration of something that had been true in their hearts for years, that they belonged together, that they were choosing each other for life. The wedding itself had been small and intimate, held in Noah's parents' backyard with just their closest family and friends in attendance. Eric had cried when he'd seen Noah waiting for him at the altar, looking impossibly handsome in his dark suit and wearing an expression of such love and joy that Eric had felt his heart might burst from happiness. Quote 49. Noah had whispered when Eric had reached him, and Eric had felt beautiful, radiant with the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. The vows they'd written had been deeply personal, filled with references to their journey from friendship to love, to the ways they had helped each other grow and discover who they were meant to be. When Noah had promised to love Eric, quote, when hiding, Eric had felt tears streaming down his cheeks. Quote, when anyone, Eric had said in return, quote, the kiss that had sealed their marriage had tasted like forever, like coming home, like every good thing Eric had ever hoped for but never quite believed he deserved. Now, 2 years married and 4 years together, Eric couldn't imagine his life any other way. They'd settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing, supporting each other's careers and dreams, while building a home that reflected both of their personalities. They'd adopted a cat named Milo who'd somehow become the center of their domestic universe, and they'd started talking seriously about children, about expanding their family in the next few years. Quote 193. Noah had asked one evening as they had sat on their balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset. Being single, I mean, the freedom of not having to consider another person in your decisions. Eric had considered the question seriously, thinking about the person he'd been before Noah, the man who drifted through relationships without ever feeling truly connected to another person. Never, he'd said finally. Quote 1 and down, quote 197. Noah had agreed, reaching over to take Eric's hand. I don't miss lying awake at night wondering if you'd ever see me as more than a friend. I don't miss pretending I was okay with just friendship when what I really wanted was this. They'd sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of them reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Eric had thought about all the ways his life had changed since that first night on Noah's couch, how he'd gone from feeling disconnected from his own existence to feeling more himself than he'd ever imagined possible. Thank you, Eric had said suddenly, and Noah had turned to look at him with curious eyes. For what? For seeing me before I saw myself, for asking the right questions, for being patient while I figured out who I was, for loving me even when I was too scared to love you back. Noah had squeezed Eric's hand, his eyes soft with understanding. Tutu, Koto 3. Eric had replied, and he'd meant it with every fiber of his being. I'll always choose you. As they'd sat there watching the sky fade from gold to deep purple, Eric had felt a contentment so profound it was almost overwhelming. This was what love was supposed to feel like, he'd realized. Not the desperate, grasping emotion he'd tried to manufacture in his previous relationships, but this steady, deep certainty that he was exactly where he belonged with exactly the right person. The conversation that had started everything came flooding back to Eric as he stood in their kitchen now, 3 years later, watching Noah nervously adjust his tie for the third time. They were getting ready for Eric's company's annual gala, an event that had always felt like a performance to Eric in the past, but now felt like an opportunity to show off the most important person in his life. Quote two of him. Eric had said, crossing the kitchen to still Noah's fidgeting hands. I want to make a good impression, Noah had replied, and Eric had been struck by the vulnerability in his voice. Even after all this time, Noah still worried about being worthy of Eric's love, still couldn't quite believe that Eric had chosen him. Baby, Eric had said softly, using the endearment that never failed to make Noah's eyes soften. Quote 208. Noah had smiled then, that warm, genuine expression that had first captured Eric's heart. I love you. I love you too, Eric had replied, straightening Noah's tie with gentle hands. 211. The gala had been everything Eric had expected, elegant and slightly pretentious, filled with colleagues making small talk and networking. But having Noah by his side had transformed the entire experience. Instead of feeling like he was playing a role, Eric had felt completely himself, proud to introduce Noah as his husband, and watching with amusement as Noah charmed everyone they met. Quote 212. Eric's boss had said during a quiet moment, and Eric had felt his chest swell with pride. He really is, Eric had agreed, watching Noah across the room as he'd listened intently to someone's story, making them feel like the most important person in the world just by paying attention. During the dinner portion of the evening, as they'd sat at their assigned table making conversation with Eric's colleagues, Noah had reached over to squeeze Eric's hand under the table. The simple gesture had sent warmth spreading through Eric's chest, a reminder of the deep connection that existed between them, even in a room full of relative strangers. Thank you for bringing me, Noah had whispered during a lull in conversation, and Eric had been struck by the gratitude in his voice. Thank you for coming with me, Eric had replied, for making everything better just by being here. The drive home had been filled with comfortable conversation about the evening, both of them processing the various interactions and amusing moments they'd witnessed. But as they'd pulled into their driveway, Eric had found himself thinking about that first night on Noah's couch, about how far they'd both come from those confused, lonely people they'd been. Quote 217. Noah had asked, noticing Eric's contemplative mood as they'd gotten ready for bed. Quote 218. Eric had replied, watching Noah brush his teeth in the bathroom mirror they now shared. Quote 219. Noah had rinsed his mouth and turned to face Eric, his expression thoughtful. Quote 22. Quote 21. Eric had said, settling onto their bed and watching Noah move through his nighttime routine. Quote 222. Quote 223. Noah had prompted, settling beside Eric and pulling him close. Quote to a turn, Eric had finished. Quote to him. Noah had been quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on Eric's arm. I used to think there was something wrong with me because I couldn't fall in love with any of the women I dated. I thought maybe I was broken somehow, incapable of the kind of deep feeling everyone else seemed to experience so easily. And now I know I was just waiting for the right person, Noah had said softly. I was waiting for you. They'd made love that night with the kind of tender passion that came from years of knowing each other's bodies and hearts, moving together like they'd been designed for each other. And afterward, as they'd lain tangled together in their bed, Eric had felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the series of events that had led them to each other. I have a confession, Eric had said into the comfortable darkness, and he'd felt Noah's attention sharpen beside him. What kind of confession? Remember that night I first slept on your couch, when I told you I felt like there was something wrong with me? Of course I remember, Tom. I was already in love with you then, Eric had admitted. I didn't understand what I was feeling. But looking back, I think I'd been in love with you for months, maybe since the day we met. Noah had turned to face him in the darkness, his hand coming up to cup Eric's cheek. Quote 236, quote to 237, quote, no, Noah had said softly. Quote 239, quote, Tron, Eric had agreed. Quote 21, no, Noah had kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of understanding. Quote Tanya, quote Tarn, Eric had replied, and he'd meant it with every fiber of his being. As they had drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, Eric had thought about all the ways love had surprised him. He'd spent so many years thinking he understood what love was supposed to feel like, trying to force himself into relationships that felt like wearing someone else's clothes. But real love, he'd discovered, felt like coming home to yourself. It felt like being seen and known and chosen not in spite of your flaws, but because of the whole, complicated, beautiful person you were. The next morning had brought the kind of lazy Sunday they both treasured, filled with coffee, in bed, and comfortable silence, and the newspaper spread between them. Eric had found himself watching Noah read, struck again by how beautiful he was in the morning light, hair mussed and wearing the old t-shirt he had stolen from Eric years ago. I can feel you staring at me, Noah had said without looking up from the sports section. But Eric could see the smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Can't help it, Eric had replied, reaching over to brush a strand of hair away from Noah's forehead. 246, quote 247. Noah had laughed, finally looking up to meet Eric's gaze. I think you might need glasses. I think my vision is just fine, Eric had said, leaning over to press a kiss to Noah's temple. Quote pouch. The conversation had been interrupted by Milo jumping onto the bed and demanding attention. But as Eric had watched Noah laugh and play with their cat, he'd felt his heart swell with affection for this life they'd built together. It wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself when he was younger, but it was so much better than anything he could have planned. Later that afternoon, as they'd worked together in their garden, Eric had found himself thinking about the future again, about the children they wanted to have, the trips they wanted to take, the ways they wanted to grow old together. The thoughts no longer scared him the way they once had. Instead, they filled him with anticipation for all the adventures still to come. What do you think we'll be like when we're old? Eric had asked, pausing in his weeding to watch Noah plant new flowers in the bed they'd been working on all spring. Noah had sat back on his heels, considering the question seriously. Quote 252, quote 253, quote to 2 much done. Eric had laughed, able to picture it perfectly. Quote quote Noah had asked, and there had been something vulnerable in his voice, like he needed reassurance that Eric truly wanted that future with him. Quote Eric had confirmed, reaching over to take Noah's dirt-covered hand in his own. I can't think of anything I'd rather do than grow old with you. The smile that had spread across Noah's face had been radiant, full of joy and relief and love. Bottom 259, quote and Eric had said, and he'd meant it as both a promise and a declaration. This was his life. This man was his person, and he'd never been more certain of anything in his entire existence. As the sun had begun to set, painting their garden in shades of gold and amber, Eric had felt a profound sense of completion. Not the kind that meant their story was over, but the kind that meant all the scattered pieces of his life had finally arranged themselves into something beautiful and whole. He'd thought about that confused, lonely man who'd shown up at Noah's door all those years ago, desperate for connection, but too afraid to name what he really wanted. That man could never have imagined this life, this love, this deep sense of belonging that Eric carried with him now like a constant source of warmth. Thank you, Eric had said suddenly, and Noah had looked up from the flowers he'd been planting. 262, quote 263, Noah had set down his gardening tools and crossed the small space between them, cupping Eric's face in his dirt-covered hands. Thank you for being brave enough to love me back, for choosing me every day, for making me feel like the luckiest person alive. They'd kissed there in their garden as the sun set around them, surrounded by the flowers they'd planted together and the life they'd cultivated with patience and care. And Eric had thought that this was what happiness looked like. Not a destination you arrived at, but a choice you made every day to build something beautiful with the person you love most. 5 years into their marriage, Eric had learned that love wasn't just about the grand gestures or the passionate moments, though they had plenty of both. It was about the small, daily choices that built a life together. It was about Noah bringing him coffee in bed every morning, prepared exactly the way Eric liked it. It was about Eric leaving little notes in Noah's lunch bag, small reminders of his love that Noah would find throughout his day. It was about the way they'd learned to fight fairly, to disagree without attacking, to work through problems as a team rather than adversaries. It was about the way they supported each other's dreams, even when those dreams required sacrifice from both of them. When Eric had been offered a promotion that would require extensive travel, they'd spent weeks discussing the implications, weighing the professional opportunity against the impact on their relationship. In the end, they decided together that Eric should take the position, but they'd also established rules about communication and made sure to plan special time together when Eric was home. I don't want success to mean anything if I can't share it with you, Eric had said during one of their planning conversations. And Noah had smiled with the kind of understanding that came from years of being truly seen by another person. You're not losing me by pursuing your dreams, Noah had replied. If anything, watching you grow and succeed makes me love you even more. The travel had been challenging at first, both of them adjusting to the rhythm of separation and reunion. But they'd made it work through constant communication and creative expressions of love. Noah had started leaving surprise gifts in Eric's suitcase for him to find on his trips. Eric had arranged for flowers to be delivered to Noah's office on days when he was missing him particularly acutely. Code 268. Noah had confessed during one of their nightly video calls while Eric was in Chicago for a conference. Boot 269, Quido 27. Eric had replied, propping his phone against the heat-all lamp so he could see Noah's face more clearly. It just makes me appreciate it more. When Eric had finally returned from that particular trip, they'd spent the entire weekend in bed, making up for lost time and reaffirming their connection. It was during one of these reunions that they'd finally had the serious conversation about starting a family. I want to have children with you, Noah had said, his head pillowed on Eric's chest as they'd lain in the aftermath of lovemaking. I want to see what kind of parents we'd be together. I want that too, Eric had replied, running his fingers through Noah's hair. The process of starting their family had been more complex than either of them had anticipated, involving lawyers and agencies in countless forms. But through it all, they'd supported each other with the kind of unwavering partnership that had defined their relationship from the beginning. When they'd finally been matched with a birth mother, a young woman named Sarah, who'd chosen them after reading their letter and meeting them in person, Eric had felt a joy so profound it had brought him to tears. She chose us, he'd said to Noah after they'd left the meeting, still hardly able to believe it was real. She chose us, Noah had agreed, and they'd held each other in the parking lot, both of them overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. The pregnancy had been a time of preparation and anticipation, both of them throwing themselves into creating a nursery and reading every parenting book they could find. Eric had been amazed by Noah's natural instincts, the way he'd researched everything from car seat safety to sleep schedules with the same thoroughness he brought to everything he cared about. Katishon. Eric had said one evening as they'd assembled the crib together, watching Noah carefully read the instructions for the third time to make sure they got it exactly right. We're going to be amazing fathers, Noah had corrected, looking up with eyes bright with excitement and love. When their daughter had finally arrived, a perfect tiny person with Eric's nose and an expression of serious concentration that reminded him immediately of Noah, Eric had felt his heart expand in ways he'd never thought possible. She's perfect, he'd whispered, holding her for the first time while Noah had looked on with tears streaming down his face. Good 281. Noah had replied, and the wonder in his voice had made Eric fall in love with him all over again. Parenthood had changed everything and nothing all at once. Their love for each other had remained the foundation of their family, but it had expanded to encompass this new little person who'd captured their hearts completely. They had navigated sleepless nights and diaper changes and the overwhelming responsibility of caring for another human being with the same teamwork that had carried them through every other challenge. Quote 282. Eric had said one night as they'd taken turns walking the floor with their fussy daughter, but I feel like I'm discovering parts of myself I never knew existed. Good parts? Noah had asked, taking the baby from Eric's arms and immediately beginning the gentle swaying motion that seemed to calm her. Gratitude. Eric had replied, watching Noah sing softly to their daughter and feeling his chest tight with love for both of them. As their daughter had grown from infant to toddler, Eric had been amazed by the way parenthood had deepened their relationship rather than straining it. They'd learned to communicate even more efficiently, to support each other through exhaustion and frustration, to find moments of connection even in the chaos of raising a small child. Remember when we thought we knew what love was? Noah had said one evening as they'd watched their 2-year-old daughter play with blocks on the living room floor, her serious concentration making both of them smile. Quote 287, Eric had replied. Quote 280, now 7 years married and with their daughter starting kindergarten, Eric often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The man who'd first slept on Noah's couch, confused and disconnected from his own life, felt like a different person entirely. Not because Eric had changed fundamentally, but because he'd finally become fully himself. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd never figured it out? Eric had asked one night as they'd sat on their back porch, sharing a bottle of wine and enjoying the rare quiet of their daughter finally to sleep. Quote 289. Noah had replied without hesitation. Quote Eric had reached over to take Noah's hand, still amazed after all these years by how perfectly they fit together. I love you. I love you too, Noah had replied, bringing Eric's hand to his lips and pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. Matayema. As they'd sat there in comfortable silence, Eric had thought about all the ways love had surprised him throughout his life. He'd spent so many years thinking he understood what he wanted, trying to force himself into relationships and situations that felt wrong, never understanding that the problem wasn't with him, but with his assumptions about what his life should look like. Meeting Noah had changed everything, not just because Eric had fallen in love with him, but because Noah had seen him clearly enough to ask the right questions. Questions that had forced Eric to examine his own assumptions, to consider possibilities he'd never allowed himself to explore. Eric had said suddenly, and Noah had turned to look at him with curious eyes. To turn to 988, quote 2 out of 99, Noah had smiled, that warm, genuine expression that had first captured Eric's heart so many years ago. Thank you for being brave enough to listen, for being willing to question everything you thought you knew about yourself, for choosing love even when it was scary. They'd made love that night with the kind of passion that came from years of knowing each other's bodies and hearts, moving together like they'd been designed for each other. And afterward, as they'd lain in each other's arms, Eric had felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the life they'd built together. I can't imagine my life without you, Eric had whispered into the darkness, and Noah's arms had tightened around him. Quote 302. Noah had replied, pressing a kiss to Eric's temple. I'm not going anywhere. Promise? Promise, you're stuck with me for the next 60 years, minimum. Eric had laughed, remembering Noah making a similar promise all those years ago when they'd first gotten together. Quote 3 on quote drafted quote Braham Eric had said, and he'd meant it as both a joke and a solemn vow. As he drifted off to sleep in Noah's arms, Eric had thought about all the ways their love story could have gone differently. All the moments when fear could have won, when they could have chosen safety over truth, when they could have settled for friendship instead of risking everything for love. But they'd been brave when it mattered most. They'd chosen honesty over comfort, love over fear, each other over the easier path. And that choice had led them here, to this life that was more beautiful than anything Eric could have imagined when he was younger. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard, Eric thought as sleep began to claim him. Sometimes the person you're meant to love has been right in front of you all along, waiting for you to become brave enough to see them clearly. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they're brave enough to see you too. The morning of their 10th wedding anniversary, Eric had woken up to find Noah already awake beside him, watching him with the same expression of wonder and love that had become familiar over the years, but never lost its power to make Eric's heart skip. Good morning, husband, Noah had said softly, brushing Eric's hair back from his face with gentle fingers. Quote 3110. Eric had replied, still amazed after all these years by how right those words felt. Quote 311, quote 3 Noah had agreed, leaning down to press a soft kiss to Eric's lips. Best 10 years of my life. They had spent the morning in bed, making love with the kind of unhurried passion that came from having all the time in the world and nowhere else they'd rather be. Their daughter was spending the weekend with Noah's parents, giving them a rare opportunity to focus entirely on each other. Told 314. Noah had said afterward, reaching into his nightstand drawer and pulling out a small wrapped package. Quote 3 Eric had protested, though he was already reaching for the present with obvious excitement. Quote 3 Son 6. Noah had said, watching Eric's face carefully as he unwrapped what turned out to be a leather-bound journal. Open it. Eric had opened the journal to find it filled with Noah's handwriting, page after page of memories and observations and love letters spanning their entire relationship. There were entries from their early days as friends, when Noah had been documenting his growing feelings without fully understanding what they meant. There were entries from their first months together, full of wonder and gratitude and disbelief that Eric had chosen him. Eric had breathed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was holding. Quote 319, quote Devranan, Noah had explained, settling beside Eric and pointing to one of the earlier entries. Quote 321, Eric had read through several entries, each one bringing back vivid memories of the moments Noah had captured. There was the night Eric had first slept on Noah's couch, described from Noah's perspective, with all the longing and hope he'd been feeling. There was their first kiss, documented in detail that made Eric's chest tight with emotion. Quote 322, Eric had said, finding an entry from early in their relationship. Quote 323, quote Tarn, Noah had said softly. Quote Amans, Eric had continued reading, finding entries that documented their engagement, their wedding, the birth of their daughter, and countless small moments in between. Noah had captured it all, and with the kind of attention to detail that spoke to how precious each moment had been to him. Quote 326. Eric had said, closing the journal carefully and looking at Noah with tears in his eyes. Quote 327. Quote 328. Noah had replied, and then they'd been kissing again, pouring 10 years of love and gratitude into the connection between them. They'd spent the rest of the day revisiting some of their favorite places, starting with the coffee shop, where they'd had their first real conversation about love and attraction. The place looked exactly the same, and as they'd sat in a corner booth sharing coffee and pastries, Eric had felt like he was seeing their younger selves in his peripheral vision. Quote 329. Eric had said, remembering the conversation that had changed everything. Quote down, quote Tarun. Noah had replied, quote Aramatam. From there, they'd driven to the cabin where they'd spent their first vacation together, where Eric had finally felt comfortable enough to talk about his fears, and Noah had listened with the patience and understanding that had defined their entire relationship. Quote Tarun. Eric had said as they'd walked along the same lake where they'd had so many important conversations. Quote 3, quote 3. They'd ended the day at the restaurant where Noah had proposed, requesting the same table where he'd gotten down on one knee 3 years earlier. The staff had remembered them, bringing out champagne and congratulating them on their anniversary with genuine warmth. Quote, Noah had said, raising his glass in a toast. Quote, Eric had agreed, clinking his glass against Noah's. And to the next 10, and the 10 after that. Always so greedy, Noah had teased, but his eyes had been soft with love and promise. As they'd driven home that evening, Eric had found himself thinking about all the ways their love had evolved over the years. It had started as friendship, deepened into romantic love, weathered the challenges of marriage and parenthood, and emerged stronger and more resilient than ever. Eric had asked as they'd pulled into their driveway. Happier, Noah had replied without hesitation. I think we'll keep getting better at loving each other. Keep learning new ways to support each other and grow together. That night, as they'd lain in bed sharing memories and making plans for the future, Eric had felt a contentment so profound it was almost overwhelming. This was what he'd been searching for his entire life without knowing it. Not just romantic love, but partnership, companionship, the deep security of being known and chosen by another person. I love you, he'd whispered into the darkness, and Noah's arms had tightened around him. I love you too, Noah had replied, more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. Even after 10 years? Especially after 10 years. Now I know what we're capable of together. Now I know how strong our love is, how much it can weather and grow through. Now I know that choosing you is the best decision I've ever made. Eric had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by gratitude for this life, this love, this person who'd seen him clearly from the very beginning and chosen to build a life with him anyway. As he drifted off to sleep, Eric had thought about the young man who'd first shown up at Noah's door, confused and disconnected from his own life. That person felt like someone from another lifetime, someone Eric could barely remember being. Not because he'd changed fundamentally, but because he'd finally become fully himself. Love had taught him that authenticity wasn't about finding yourself in isolation, but about being seen clearly by another person and discovering who you were in relationship to them. Noah had helped Eric understand not just that he was gay, but that he was capable of the kind of deep, lasting love he'd always thought was beyond his reach. And Eric had helped Noah understand that he was worthy of being loved completely, that his patience and kindness and gentle strength were gifts that deserved to be treasured. Together, they'd created something beautiful and lasting, a love that had grown stronger with time rather than fading. Quote 348. Eric had whispered one last time before sleep claimed him, and though Noah was already asleep, Eric had felt the gratitude settle into his bones like a prayer. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for teaching me what love really feels like. Thank you for this life we've built together, for our daughter, for every ordinary moment that has become extraordinary because we're sharing it. Thank you for being exactly who you are and for loving me exactly as I am. In the morning, they'd wake up to their daughter jumping on their bed, demanding pancakes and stories about their special day. They'd make breakfast together as a family, Noah and Eric moving around each other in the kitchen with the easy choreography of people who'd learned each other's rhythms long ago. And Eric would watch Noah flip pancakes while their daughter chattered about her weekend with her grandparents. And he'd feel that familiar surge of love and gratitude for the life they'd created together. A life that had started with confusion and fear and grown into something beautiful beyond his wildest dreams. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard, Eric would think as he watched his family. Sometimes the person you're meant to love has been right in front of you all along, waiting for you to become brave enough to see them clearly. And sometimes if you're very lucky, they're brave enough to see you too. Then we're both exactly where we need to be.